y'all, Jane Corley here with PicVisions, Media Arts and Photography. If it's your first time here, welcome. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll be notified every time a new video is uploaded. This is the first video in our Photography and Media Arts category. For starters, we're going to begin with photography. Today's video, we're going to focus on the basics of photography. Really just start from the beginning. First thing you need to talk about when it comes to photography is exposure. What is exposure? Exposure is made up of three entities: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So I know when you get your first DSLR camera, you really just want to start shooting on manual mode, you want to become a boss, you want to get it all right, but it can be really frustrating if you don't understand what makes up the primary components of exposure. So let's start with aperture. I'm sure you've noticed different priority setting modes on your camera dial. First one we're going to talk about is the aperture priority. The aperture priority is going to allow you to adjust your aperture to a larger opening or a smaller opening where light can pass through the lens, and your camera will make the adjustments to the shutter speed, the ISO, and the white balance if you haven't set to auto white balance. The aperture setting on your camera will allow you to select the f-stop, the aperture, of your camera, and then your camera will make adjustments to the shutter speed and the ISO to create the perfect exposure. The larger the aperture setting number is, so f22, f36, that is going to allow less light to pass through your lens, creating a clearer and crisper and more content in your image. The smaller number of f-stop is going to create a larger opening in your lens, allowing more light to pass through your lens opening, creating a smaller depth of field, a smaller area of focus. F-stops are calculated by the ratio of focal length over the diameter of your lens opening. The larger the lens opening, the smaller the f-stop value. As you increase the f-stop number step by step, you are now decreasing the amount of light entering your camera by half. Similar to the aperture value mode, there is a shutter speed priority mode. If you're in that shutter speed priority mode, you will be able to manually adjust the shutter speed, and the camera will make the adjustments to the aperture and ISO in order to achieve perfect exposure. Shutter speed is measured in seconds, or rather fractions of a second. You will be able to adjust your shutter speed based on how long you want your shutter to be open. So it would make sense, the longer the shutter is open, the more light has opportunity to get through your camera lens. So for instance, a longer shutter speed, a prolonged exposure, is going to result in photos I'm sure you've seen like blurred motion, or even when people are drawing with sparklers for the holidays. That would be a prolonged, longer exposure time. Whereas a shorter shutter speed release, it's called stop motion, is used if you wanted to stop a runner in midair or a bird in the sky, you wanted to stop freeze. That would be a shorter shutter release. Next, try manual mode. Leave your ISO to automatic, maybe even go in and set your white balance, make sure that's on automatic, but try the manual mode. Try playing with that relationship between shutter and aperture and really find that middle ground to achieve that perfect exposure. If you're still a little confused, if you still are having issues, try when you look in your viewfinder, you will see a metering bar down at the bottom. As you make your aperture and shutter speed adjustments, you will see that metering bar shift from left to right, translating something that would be overexposed or something that would be underexposed. The perfect formula for your aperture and shutter speed will give you something right down the middle of that exposure metering bar. So, some of y'all might be asking, Jane, what happened to step 3, ISO? Well, now that you know the relationship between aperture and shutter, let's get you off of automatic ISO. The ISO numbers will determine how sensitive the sensor within your camera is to light. So if you're shooting in a concert hall and there's not a lot of light around where you are, just on the stage, but you really want to get that person performing on stage, if you increase your ISO, your sensor in your camera will make the adjustment to be more sensitive to all the light that it can get within the crowd all the way to the stage, allowing your stage photos to be really crispy. But do pay attention to the potential of what's called noise or grain in your image. The goal of a photographer is to keep their ISO low. If you can keep your ISO as low as possible and make compromises to your aperture and your shutter speed to let more light in rather than amping up your sensor's capability to receiving light, your images will come out a lot smoother, a lot less pixelated or over sharpened. So your ISO can be manipulated with your aperture and your shutter, and you can have a little bit more give and take among the 3 platforms. So, as we have learned, all aspects of exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO have a fixed relationship with each other when it comes to shooting on manual mode. If you need more light into your camera, you can either lower f-stop or slower shutter, or even higher ISO. So get out there and start shooting. What are some experiments that you're playing with exposure? How are you manipulating your aperture and shutter speed and ISO relationship? Leave some comments below with your pictures. I'd love to see them. Join us next time when we talk about depth of field. Until then, I'm Jane Corley with PicVisions Media Arts and Photography. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you can be notified when new videos are uploaded. See you next time, guys.